Hello, Sean Oskay, professor of design at Southern Oregon University, and today's lecture is about model making, and that's a big topic. We're going to talk about the different kinds of models and their uses, what they're good for. We're going to talk about materials and tools that you're going to want to look into, and then I've got a whole bunch of pro tips at the end to make your model building process easier and more enjoyable, and also to get a better quality model out at the end. So let's just take a look at models in general and know that everybody loves models. Directors love models. They're great for show and tells and on display in the lobby and the whole thing. But be aware that a model like this takes a lot of time. You can create a model that's going to be useful as a communication tool. It's not necessarily a work of art, but for a really handsome model like this, and especially if you've seen maybe a model for a Broadway show and you're very impressed with how beautiful it is, don't forget that maybe one or even two assistants we're doing that as a full-time job, 10 hours a day for 2 weeks to build that model. And that's certainly much more than you're going to need to do for me for any of the classes that you might be taking with me. That doesn't mean that I don't expect you to do your best job, but a really high level quality model takes a lot of time and effort. But you can get some good results with much less than that. So just don't be put off. Don't feel like you can't do a good model because you're looking at something that's been very expertly done. However, people love to see models because they're the clearest form of a representation of what the set's going to look like that we can give our design colleagues or a director. Now, of course, a model can, if it's well lit, give us the same kind of evocative feel that we get from a rendering. That's really what renderings are best for, is like really giving us mood, and maybe a scene that's got a lot of details in it, a lot of furniture, a lot of props, things that are fussy and hard to make for a model. So we might want to go for a rendering for something like that. But even a nicely well-lit model can give us that sense of mood as well if we take some photographs of it. What models are really best for, though, is showing a lot of detail and a lot of texture, a lot of surfaces, but most importantly, for making a set that's otherwise not clear to a director and your colleagues. So for example, maybe it's a black box design set or an environmental staging where you've got audience all over the place. And it's really hard to figure out, well, what vantage point are you going to draw your perspective rendering from? Because you can see this set from all different angles. So unless you're going to do a whole lot of renderings, sometimes a model is a more efficient way to show that. So people can look at the model and get a whole sense of the space right away. Models are also super useful for a unit set that has a lot of changes. So a musical or Shakespeare or something where you've got a few parts that are constantly moving around. This wall is going to slide over here and this wagon is going to track down on stage. Well, you can create that model with all those moving parts and then take photographs of every single scene and then show that to a director. You could even give all of those toys to the director and the stage manager to use during the rehearsal process, and they can have your model with them and move things around to figure out the best way to stage something while they're actually blocking the show. So there's a lot of reasons why a model is a very powerful communication tool. But again, it takes a lot of time and effort to get a really pretty model, but good results like this one can fool us that we're not looking at a production photo. This is a model. These are little cutout figures, photographs of people, but this is actually a well-built and well-lit model, not a production photograph. So we can get all kinds of architectural details. We can see the whole set really clearly. You can just kind of move your head around and zip around the space in a way that's hard to do with a rendering where you have a fixed point of view. So models are very useful for that. But another thing that they're extremely important for, their advantage over a rendering, is a design like this one. This is a nice handsome model, although if you look closely, it's pretty simple and a little rough around the edges in some places. But what it's showing us immediately when we look at it is that this is a cylindrical shaped set, and there's this overhanging rings up there, but those are ellipses, and that the set has forced perspective built into it. So if you were to draw a picture of this and give it to the director, they might look at that and say, oh, is this just the forced perspective required of drawing in perspective, or are these flats actually kind of flaring up? And are those circles or are they ellipses? Well, the model is going to instantly communicate that to anybody looking at it. They're going to say, oh yeah, I can totally see that that wall upstage center is on 90s and square, and that the other ones are flaring up with forced perspective. And those rings overhead are actually ovals and not circles drawn in perspective. So another way that models can be extremely useful. And if we put a little time and attention into the way we photograph and present our models, not only for showing it as a communication tool during the production, but also in our portfolios. Because, you're just not going to carry models around the country with you. So photograph your models whenever you can. And you can just do a little snapshot like I've done here of my old cabaret model from years ago that's seen better days. But this is just taking a quick picture of it. And it looks okay. But just a little bit of effort, so just lowering the viewpoint of the camera, getting the camera kind of down at the audience eye level, and then taking a picture with a little bit better lighting. Maybe it's a couple of desk lamps that you set up, to give yourself some good lighting angles. And then I just took the picture into Photoshop and blacked out the areas that I didn't want to see, just made them black below and above the model, right? And just those couple of quick steps, taking a little bit of effort before I clicked the shutter, made for a much more effective way. This looks a whole lot better than the previous one with just a few steps of technique. And then even just a little bit more, so this is just maybe 10 minutes in Photoshop. I threw on some lighting effects there and made a few things kind of look like they were glowing, and it looks like a rendering. So this is a photograph of that same model that we saw in the previous two slides with 10 minutes worth of tweaking in Photoshop to get something that's very evocative of the scene. So models can not only be a dimensional thing that we can see to map out the space, but we can also use that as the basis for other kinds of communication tools. And I just wanted to show you some examples, some of your student colleagues in set one here. This is Cameron's model for Servant of Two Masters from a couple of years ago. And he did a really nice model with this kind of Dr. Seuss sort of world and gave himself some real challenges with all these funny curved staircases. And he did a good job. He cut this out of watercolor paper, but it could have been cardstock or other media to create this very otherwise complicated space very effectively with his model. And Meg Chambers did a nice job in her set for the same play. She wanted the set to feel like it was kind of dissolving and floating away. So she took these little tubes of acetate and painted on them with the suggestion that some of these objects would be suspended from above and the other bits would be attached to the stage floor. And she's got these little panels kind of floating away and a real clever little paper clip and gold duct tape chandelier. It's kind of hard to see up against that flat, but notice she's also got a nice little figure in here, and so does Josie in her model. Including a figure in your model is essential because we want to get that human scale reference point. So even if it's a simple little figure like this one, you do want a little figure in your model. And Josie did a nice job painting this model. It's very clear. She did a good job with the scale. Really looks like this little paper figure could walk around and interact with the model. And that's really what you need. It doesn't need to look like those models that the Broadway designer's assistant spent weeks working on. This is a perfectly fine model for set one. Maybe a little more polished than this for your second or third year MOTS graduate model, but this is kind of in the ballpark. Let's take a look at the different kinds of models that are out there. The sketch model, or the draft or bash model, there's no official name for this kind of model, is something that maybe you're just doing for yourself and nobody sees it but you. If you don't like drawing so much, or you have a hard time with perspective, but you're much more kind of tactile sculptor, you're kind of a sculptor, you can just grab some scrap paper and some masking tape, some scotch tape, whatever, chop up a cereal box, and get going on starting to kind of doodle in 3D. So as you're developing an idea, maybe you're going to have a hard time drawing that in perspective as a thumbnail sketch, but you can kind of fold some paper over and kind of tack it down with some poster tack or whatever, kind of hold things into place until you can get something that kind of starts to flesh out your idea. Then you can take a picture of that and use that as the basis of your sketch. Even though it's not going to have these big weird seams and chunks of masking tape in there, you can ignore those when you draw on top of it with your sketch, but it can be a great starting point to help you visualize something in 3D, especially if you're more sculptural instead of drawing perspective minded. A white model is an actual official kind of model that is presented at a production meeting, usually earlier in the process when the colors maybe haven't been decided yet, or the whole thing is still kind of in flux, where you might be able to present a model like this. This is simply the drafting that has been printed out and applied to some foam core and then cut out. It's a very common technique that we'll use to create a white model very quickly, especially since we've already done the work of drawing it all up in scale. So just printing it out, gluing it down, cutting it out, it's a super fast way to do it. Now, of course, the full color model, like Ming-Cho Lee's model here for Boris Godunov, they're fantastic. They're gorgeous. I think this is a 1-inch scale model. It's enormous, but he's doing it for the Metropolitan Opera, and they've got the budget and the time to create a fantastically detailed model like this. So this is obviously the other extreme of what we're talking about, but a full color model is something that we can do, again, with some basic tools and materials that I will show you here next. Let's look at the essential tools. This little photograph has basically got the essential tools that you need, but let's break these down down. You really need a craft knife. Obviously, X-Acto is the most famous brand name, but it doesn't matter. You can use a generic version, but you want a knife that holds this little number 11 blade. And it's probably the blade that's in the knife. If you just go to the bookstore or the grocery store or whatever, and you buy a little craft knife, it's almost certainly going to have this number 11 blade in it. And that's the one you want. They make all different kinds of blades for different particular kinds of techniques, but we just need the basic blade. When you're buying extra blades, and you're going to want to, you can't get away with, even for just the one class, you can't get away with just the blade that came with the knife, especially if you're getting a hand-me-down blade, a friend is lending you a blade, the blade that's in there is probably already dull. So trust me on this, one of the biggest frustrations and even hazards, because it's dangerous to cut with a dull blade, is underestimating how quickly a blade goes dull. And the most expensive way to buy them is in this little blister pack of like 4 for $6 or something. It's a scam trying to buy small quantities of blades. You're much better off if you're a Mott student, just spend the $30 and buy 100 pack of blades. You'll use them up, and it'll be a great investment. If you're an undergrad student, you don't want to spend that much money for 100 blades. That's going to, you're never going to use that many. Well, go in with 2 or 3 friends and then divide it up. So if you buy, 4 people buying 100 pack of blades for $30, you're getting 25 blades for 30 cents a piece, basically, instead of the $2.40 a piece for the little blister pack. So really buy in bulk. It's one of the things that's true for most things in life, but in this case, X-Acto blades are so much more expensive in small quantities. The English tend to use scalpels instead of X-Acto knives. I've never used them myself, but I hear that the blades are finer, they're thinner, which is nice, but they're also more fragile, so they tend to break more often. But if you have a scalpel for whatever reason, or access to them, medical blades are a useful way to go ahead and do that. You can use that instead of an X-Acto knife. Here's the tools that I don't want you to use. These are all very noble, useful tools, and they have their uses. Some of them even for model making. But, obviously the chainsaw is hyperbole, but I've seen plenty of models that look like they were cut with a chainsaw. And you're probably not going to use a combat knife or a chef's knife. The other 4, 5 are useful tools, but they're not going to replace your X-Acto knife. Now that snap knife up at the top is great for cutting heavy duty things. So maybe you're cutting some illustration board out, or you're cutting dowels or something like that. The snap knives are great for that, just like the carpet knives, or the mat knives. Those are good tools, but don't go down to the scene shop and get a mat knife and use that to cut your foam core. It's going to be a disaster. The little green snap knife there is a great tool. I love using those when I'm cutting foam. So like styrofoam or extruded foam, that's a great carving tool. Extend the blade way out like it is right there. And that's a terrific way to cut through softer materials like that. Otherwise, a pair of scissors is great for cutting paper or cutting string, that kind of stuff. You obviously probably have a pair of scissors already, so that's terrific. Just don't try to use your scissors to cut foam core or illustration board or any of that kind of stuff. It's just not going to be a happy thing. You also are going to want a cutting mat. And again, a little one like this, a little 8.5 by 11 is dollars, like $6, $8 for a little cutting mat. I would recommend spending a little bit more and getting like an 11 by 17 size. But you do want some soft surface to cut on for a variety of reasons. Some of them are safety reasons. So if you're cutting on a soft material, then the tip of your blade is actually sinking into the cutting mat or the piece of scrap foam or whatever it is that you're cutting into. And that's doing 2 important things. One, it's actually letting you cut with a whole lot more of the blade than just the very tip, as if you're cutting on a hard surface. But when you're cutting on a cutting mat and you get to the end of your material, when you're cutting on a soft surface, your material is still kind of cutting through the rubber of the mat, and it keeps your blade from zipping off. But when you're done cutting your material on a hard surface, suddenly it's an ice skate, and your blade goes zoop, and suddenly it's in your thigh. So it's actually a safety thing about having that teeny tiny little bit of a blade skating around on a hard surface. Not only are you going to wear that blade down so much faster cutting on a hard surface, it's actually a dangerous thing. Now, of course, you can, in a pinch, use something other than a cutting mat. So you left it at school and you're finishing up your model and you realize, oh shoot, I just need to make these 3 little cuts. Well, all right, a magazine, a stack of newspaper, a scrap of foam. There's plenty of things that'll work instead. But but you're not going to want to try to do a whole model on those materials because you're just going to make a mess. It's going to be confetti if you try to do that. A cardboard box or something like that, it's like that's fine for one or two quick cuts in a pinch, but otherwise it's going to be really hard to do quality work on something that isn't an actual cutting mat. They're so inexpensive and they're so useful. Just get a cutting mat. If you're in my class, you can borrow them for the term, but please use a cutting mat, either one of the universities or one you get for yourself. Don't try to cut on other kinds of surfaces. You definitely need a steel straight edge for the same reason, safety and efficiency. A steel straight edge is just, it's what you need. You need this one right here. Again, it's in the bookstore for a couple of bucks for the little foot-long one, super easy. The little framing squares are also very useful if you have one of those, because then you also get the 90-degree corner, which is very useful as well. And you want that steel edge to protect yourself and the thing that you're cutting. If you're cutting on something that's slippery or something that's soft, like a plastic straight edge, then you're going to divot into that material. It's going to slide around. You're going to waste time and materials by not having a good metal straight edge to make your cuts on. Trust me on this. There's even these new styles that are coming out, these little M-shaped ones that let you put your fingers in the little valley, and so they're even a little bit more protected from your cut. In case you veer off, you jump over off the tracks, and your fingers aren't right there. You've got to go up the hill to get to your fingers with this tool. So I'm thinking about getting one for myself. But notice what this person is doing here. They are cutting out this picture from this piece of paper, and they're placing the straight edge on the picture so that the waste side is exposed. So if you do veer away from the straight edge, you're cutting into the waste. You're not cutting into the picture. So that's an important thing to be aware of. And please trust me on this. Don't use your plastic tools as a cutting guide. You will make a notch the very first time you try. So just you're too lazy to get up and get your straight edge because it's across the room. You're like, I could just use my plastic triangle because it's right here, and oh, now I have ruined my plastic triangle. Trust me on this, they're just too soft to use as a cutting material. It's again also dangerous because they are so soft, and suddenly you're cutting the second time with it after you've made a divot, and then the knife goes into that little divot and it steers you off course, and suddenly it's in your finger. Not good. Although it is oftentimes plastic, an architect's scale rule is not a cutting straight edge, but an essential tool because we are working in scale, and the same scale rule that you use for your drafting is perfectly fine for your model making. There's no reason to have two. They do make aluminum ones. I have a nice aluminum one, but your plastic rule that you're using for your drafting is fine for that. Again, I just used the see-through triangle there with a big red no on it, but you do need some kind of 90-degree corner, whether it's a metal T-square or that framing square we were looking at before, or you can do what I'm doing down here in the photograph and use your drafting triangle with a straight edge in combination to create that 90-degree corner. But you're going to need to make a lot of 90-degree cuts. So having some way to create that 90-degree angle easily and safely is a really excellent thing. So even if you're just using your drafting triangles to draw with pencil a guideline, and then you place your steel straight edge on top of that guideline, you're going to need some kind of ability, even in your T-square, some ability to make a 90-degree mark on your materials, because we got a lot of those to cut. And there's tons of cool tools. If you're thinking BFA design, or you're a grad student, you're going to be doing a lot more model making in the future, there's a lot of great tools that you can use. I have most of these, but if your grandfather gave you that X-Acto knife wooden box set kit, congratulations. You don't need anything in there but the knife and the number 11 blade, but there's some great tools in there, and if somebody gives it to you, congratulations, that's awesome. But you certainly don't need to go out and buy something like that, even for mods, even though there are plenty of other tools that we can play with. And the king of those is a Dremel tool. If you have a Dremel tool already, they're full of all kinds of rotozip blades and grinding wheels and sandpaper wheels, and there's all kinds of different little carving tools, especially great for carving in foam. Don't go out and buy one if you don't have one, but they are really a useful tool if you've already got one. However, you probably have things like what's on the screen right here, right? So some ability to hold something for you while you're doing other things is very important. Either you're holding something in place or you're holding something while the glue dries. These are all super useful. So a bunch of binder clips in different sizes are great. The little baggy clips, that hold your chip bag closed, are just perfect because the spring is kind of weak, and it's really great to just hold two pieces of foam core together without crushing it the way a harder one, like the spring clamp up in the corner, that's a little aggressive, but maybe, there might be a time when that's useful. You might have an alligator clip or a roach clip. for some other purpose. We won't go into that, but those are also great for holding things down. And then a pair of tweezers is really useful, not so much as a clip in this case, but sometimes it's just easier to use tweezers to pinch something while you're working on it. Then your fingers are kind of big, especially in 1/4 inch scale. So just having tweezers to be able to hold something while you're making a tiny little modification to it, putting a little bit of glue somewhere, tweezers can be useful. They're also great for then making little adjustments to small props or things in your model. Rubber bands and plain old paper clips can be very useful sometimes for just holding something together. And if you have one of these little soldering magnifying glass things, I wouldn't go buy one. I don't have one, but if you got one, I could see that being a really handy tool to use as well. Couple of pieces of sandpaper will really save you a lot of time. It's the difference between an okay model and a really handsome looking model is just going over your cuts with a couple of swipes of the sandpaper to really clean up those edges, get all the little burrs off. It makes a big difference. You can also fix, you didn't quite get that curve cut just right. That's kind of a lumpy side where you can smooth that out a little bit. Little emery nail boards are great for that. Those little foam covered sanding blocks are useful. You can just glue down some sanding paper to a dowel or a pencil or something like that. And now you've got an interior radius sanding or even sculpting tool. And then I came across this great little hack somebody did with a little electric toothbrush where they put a little sanding disc on the end of the electric toothbrush. And, it looks like a great idea. There's also plenty of circle cutting tools. The one I have is the little orange yellow one up there, the quilting cutting tool. And I don't really use it to cut the material. I just use it to kind of score a little groove that I can then drop my X-Acto blade in and kind of follow that little scored groove out. It does take a lot of effort to actually cut any kind of material with one of those blades. You can do basically the same thing with a good compass. And I recommend having a compass for drawing big arcs anyway, even for your drafting. But you can kind of drag. Sometimes I'll put the pencil in the origin point and use the metal tip, the pin, to scratch a curve in. So basically use it in the other direction than you would if you were striking a line. They make these like circle cutters that are really cool. Kind of, you spin it around and it slowly lowers the blade down. They're really expensive, like $35-40. I don't even own one, but if you see yourself cutting a lot of circles, that's really cool. And then there are the other two pictures down there. I'm not advocating that, but when you're a student, you gotta sometimes, necessity, right? So make sure it's metal. Don't use a Tupperware lid or something for the same reason. But you might be walking through your kitchen, taking a break from building a model, and you notice that can of sweet corn on the shelf, and think, hey, that's about the right size for the platform I'm trying to cut out. The little rabbet cutters are cool. Again, if you're going to do more models than just set one, they're great because they allow you to do a seamless corner. It's this little tool that you pass over the edge of your foam core, and it cuts a little slot out so that you can overlap the two corners without having the foam edge sticking out. So a great little tool. They're not very expensive, but you certainly don't need it for the one class. Materials. So basically, model making materials, anything on earth. So with one exception in my case, don't use plants. If it's going to wilt or rot, don't use it. Now the exception to that, of course, is twigs or organic material that has been prepared, like the moss that you can get in model shops for model trains or whatever. Great, those are fine. But don't put plants. That little pine needle bough, 2 days later, it's going to be, like your Christmas tree that you didn't take down until February. So not a good idea to put anything that's actually going to die and wilt and fall apart on your model. The exception to that, of course, are things that are like wood. That's obviously an organic material. Here's a model that's got we did a funeral grass carpet for the set. This is Love's Labor's Lost from a little while back. I just painted some sandpaper green. There you go. That's about the right scale in terms of the texture of it. And then these the shrubbery hedges there, I think I just dyed some sawdust, just stirred some sawdust into some green paint, let that dry out. And then I just painted the little paper forms for the hedges with some Gesso or some Tacky glue or whatever, and just like patted the sawdust into that, and it looked great, right? And then the rest of the material was all cut drops anyway, so it was flat. So that's just paper cut out. But you also want to think about the scale of the objects that you're using in terms of organic things as well. Plain old bond paper, printer paper. We've all made paper airplanes or origami cranes or whatever, and we know how just a regular piece of paper with a couple of folds in it can be really strong. And there's the ability to kind of twist it into some shapes that other materials just don't want to do. Sometimes just plain old paper is just the right thing for you to use. I mean, there's plenty of people who make all kinds of crazy art. I'm sure you've seen them online. These people that do these amazing art sculptures out of just a piece of paper. So now I just did this one because I thought, it's going to take me less time to just do this really quickly and cut it out and photograph it than it is to try to find it online. And so I just made this little paper chair. It's out of just a regular piece of printer paper and just drew it out in scale. It's in quarter-inch scale, so it's little teeny tiny. You can see it there relative to the X-Acto blade. It's tiny, but that's just scored and folded, and there you go. You can make a little chair or a little table or whatever, all sorts of things out of just a regular piece of paper. Sometimes that's the easiest thing to do. I would typically do that out of cardstock, maybe some thin cardstock, but cardstock's going to be a little tougher than the regular piece of paper is, but don't underestimate just a plain old piece of paper. Especially for something like a cyc or whatever, knock yourself out. Cardstock and Bristol board is one of my favorite model making tools because it's so easy to cut and it's pretty tough and it'll hold its shape. You can score it and fold it nicely. You can print on it. You can paint on it. You can do all kinds of things with it. It's such a common material that it's usually what we do for a white model. We'll just print out onto cardstock and then cut that out and glue it down and instant model. It's pretty cool. Now, illustration board, crescent board is a brand name. It's like mat board, museum board. There's all kinds of different various names of different kinds of boards. And they're just a nicer quality cardboard. So this is somebody that has taken their drawing and laminated it onto a piece of illustration board, and they're cutting that out. Now, illustration board is really an excellent material to cut out from. It's very strong. It's great, especially in larger scales and half-inch or full or 1 inch to the foot model. In 1 inch, it's almost like the same thickness as 3/4 board, 3/4 plywood or 3/4 pine board. So it's really useful to work in that scale. But that's a scale pretty big, and we don't really work in that scale very often. And the other problem with illustration board is, even though I love it and it's great, and it comes in different colors and different surfaces, and you can get metallic surfaces, and it's terrific. But it's a little expensive, and the biggest drawback to it, in my opinion, is that you do have to really work at cutting it. It's going to take several passes with your knife. You really got to kind of buff out and put some effort into cutting the illustration board, especially if you're going to cut it nicely. So it's a little bit more work, but it's a very forgiving material to work with for both paints and glues. It's really easy to glue and paint. Foam board, of course, or foam core, which is a brand name, and that's how it's spelled. Foam core is just basically foam that has been laminated with 2 pieces of paper on either side. I'm sure you've used one for a science project or something. It's so ubiquitous that I'm not really going to go into it, but what we use it all the time. It's a major model making material for our theater house box, for platforms, that kind of stuff. It's great for that. Now, do be aware that there's lots of different qualities. The foam board that you get at the dollar store is okay, but that's meant to be like a car wash sign or something, really temporary. It's the paper on the outside of it's real kind of washboardy, and then the foam inside of it is full of junk, hard chunks that as you're cutting it, you're going to hit those chunks and they're going to rip out of the edge of the foam core. And maybe it doesn't matter if you're just using it as some structural underneath something and you're going to cover it up. But be aware that the dollar store foam board is really not as nice to work with as you think it is. So that, you're going to pay $2 or $3 for the good foam core or $1 at the dollar store. But by the way, the nice board is also a little bit bigger dimension as well, so you're actually getting more boards. So it's not as much of a cost savings as you think it is. Sometimes it's just a couple extra bucks to get the good stuff, and you're just going to have a better experience. So not all foam core is the same. Styrofoam is the actual name for what we're looking at here. It's rigid insulation, it's high density styrene, and Styrofoam is a brand name owned by Dow Chemical, and that's the blue foam that we're looking at right here. When we think Styrofoam, we usually mean the low density bead foam, which we're going to look at next. It's also in this top picture. But Owens Corning has their pink foam. They're basically the same thing. And they're wonderful to carve with, especially if you're trying to do organic shapes. You're doing something where you want a kind of a cliff face with some stairs carved into it or whatever. Well, I've got a picture of that in a couple of slides. But it's great to carve with, and it's great to use. You can use hacksaw blades. You can use those snap knives with the blades extended out. Be careful as you're cutting with those long blades, but it carves very easily. A little coat of gesso, and you can paint on it beautifully. It's a great model making material. Bead foam is a little coarser, but it's also super easy to cut, and it's everywhere. You can just save it from the last thing that got mailed to you, and it's kind of a free material, especially for more organic or rougher kind of shapes. It's great to use. Florist foam is also super easy. You can just almost do it with your fingers. It's so soft. But don't forget that florist foam has a couple of drawbacks. It's a little expensive. It's full of formaldehyde, And so it's a little toxic, and it's also meant to absorb moisture. So anything that you're going to try to paint on it is it's just a difficult surface to paint on it because it's kind of crumbly, and it's also like sucking all the moisture out of your paints and things. So it seems like a good idea until you try working with it, but sometimes it's the right thing, especially if you can coat it quickly enough. So organic surfaces, like I was talking about, staircase in a cliff face or whatever. I mean, nothing beats carving into styrofoam or bead foam for that kind of thing. It looks terrific. Or really complicated shapes. So here's somebody trying to carve an archway that has this kind of beveled curve in there, and he's basically sanded that out with this little tool. You can see it down in the lower right-hand corner. Basically glued some sandpaper to that half round there, and then use that to carve out that shape. So it carves really well. You can use hot knives or even soldering irons or things. People do, like this person here, but it is off-gassing toxic gas when you do that. When you're melting the plastic, it is giving off nasty stuff. So be careful using hot tools on that. But you can sand it, you can file it, you can crush it. You know, sandpaper is, I think, a great sculptural media, or any kind of like grinding tools. That's where that dremel tool really comes into play. It's terrific for etching things into it. And you can get a coarser blade, a little keyhole saw or a hacksaw, something like that. A little craft saw is great for cutting the foam, because a little bit heavier duty teeth is a lot easier than trying to cut it with the razor blades. My all-time favorite, it's a free material, and that's the food foam trays, meat tray. You get them under your cheese or whatever you're buying at the grocery store. And I hang on to them for paint trays, for all sorts of uses, as you may know. But it's also a fantastic model building tool, because it's basically the same kind of foam that's in that insulation, except it's 3/16 of an inch thick. So you can cut it like butter. I mean, these quick, sweepy, curvy shapes, it's super easy to cut in. Do be aware that it does have a plastic film on it to make it food safe, and you need to knock that off with a little sandpaper. Just a real quick, 15 seconds with some fine grit sandpaper will wipe that right off. It's super easy to come off. Sometimes you can even grab a corner and peel it off, but there is a film of plastic on there that's going to really resist paint if you're trying to paint on it. But if you just knock it off with sandpaper, couple of seconds is great. They make some kind, there's a waffle impression in it, like this one. And if you find the ones that don't have any impression, grab those, because they're really useful for all kinds of stuff. You can crush into it. It's fantastic. There's also a fairly expensive material that you can find called task board. Architects use it for their models a lot. It's basically kind of a wood pulp product that's sort of like a super fine, low density fiberboard kind of thing. And that is, and the neat thing about it is that you can get it wet and then curl it into various shapes, and then when it dries, it stays in that shape. It's also super useful for laser cutting. So if you've seen any laser cutting done on campus, it's probably done with some task board, and that's because it's so fine. The pulp in it is so fine, it doesn't screw up the laser cutter. You can make teeny tiny little cuts. So it's a little expensive, but it's a really neat material, and you're certainly welcome to play with that. There's basswood and balsa wood. If you've ever made one of these little balsa wood planes, you know what balsa wood is. Basswood's a little harder. The neat thing about basswood is you can go into a hardware store or a craft shop or whatever and buy basically dimensional lumber. So if you were doing a set that needed a lot of 4x4s or something, you were doing some kind of like half timbered construction thing for a crucible set or whatever, you were building a dock, for some play, I don't know, whatever. And cutting all those long boards, 4x4s or whatever, out of some of the material would be kind of time consuming and hard to get super straight. So sometimes just going into the store and just buying, it's not that expensive, buying the little dimensional boards. But don't forget, you want to actually think about the math, how tiny a 4x4 is in quarter-inch scale. I mean, it's like a matchstick, so you don't want to grab something that, oh, this is satisfyingly 4x4 feeling, and then you get home and you realize that that's actually 1 foot by 1 foot. I bought quarter-inch by quarter-inch basswood, and that's huge, timbers instead of what I was trying for, that 4x4 or whatever. And balsa wood is also super easy to cut into, although it is fairly fragile. There's all kinds of sculpting materials that are out there. You can play with air dry and oven dry styles that are fine to work with. I don't tend to use them, but if you enjoy that kind of thing, knock yourself out. You can make beautiful works of art with that kind of material, like the little vase at the left, and they usually end up looking like ashtrays from kindergarten. But anyway, wire is a great material to use. Wire comes in all different gauges. Really fine wire is great for hanging flown units. A lot of times people want to use like thread to hang some flown units, especially if there's a lot of them. They can, as you're moving your model box around, they're going to get all tangled around each other and it can be a real pain. Whereas in a piece of wire is a lot more rigid and it's not going to flip around and get tangled in with its neighbors. So I recommend that for hanging flown objects in your model box. But wire is also great for like pipes or handrails or scaffolding or whatever. If you do need a whole lot of long lengths of it, I usually go down to the hardware store and buy the little surveyor's flags. They're about a foot long or maybe 14, 15 inches long, and they got the little plastic yellow flag on it or whatever. Just rip that off, and you've got a nice long straight length of wire that's about the right size of 2-inch pipe in scale. So that's a great way to create scaffolding or whatever without having to stretch out, straighten out coiled up wire, which can take a long time to make that straight. They make these little jigs like this, again, just at a craft store or Amazon or whatever for a few bucks, and you can bend in tight little corners and things. And of course, needle nose pliers are kind of essential if you're going to do any kind of work with wire. The little chairs here in that cabaret model that I was showing you before, again, same thing, those little looped around a chair. Just made a bunch of those. The music stands there are just a little piece of paper with a little fold in it to make the music stand part. And then it's just a piece of wire that, or you can even use a straight pin or something like that and just poke it into the floor of your model. You can get clever with those kinds of things. The seats of my little cabaret chairs there are actually little coins cut off of a hot glue stick. And then I took the hot glue gun and softened, melted the one side of it, and then pressed that into the wire legs and back of the chair. And then as it cooled, it glued itself into place. Hot glue is also the light bulbs in the foreground right there. That's just a straight pin with a little hot glue dipped around it. And it takes a long time to make the right one. I probably did like a dozen and then picked the best of them because sometimes they get a little pointy or whatever. But you can make things like light bulbs and that kind of stuff. A little dab of hot glue. That's on our list of materials coming up here. And wire is great for an armature. You can create a little tree or some kind of shape that would be difficult to make out of some kind of material that you might wrap this in, like say paper mache or hot glue or something like that. It's not going to be structurally supportive of itself. It'll just collapse under its own weight. But if you give it some kind of armature underneath, then you can coat that thing with whatever the other material is, the less strong material that's actually giving you the surface that's going to be on the outside of it. I came across this photograph. Somebody made a very clever trees here, or branches, with just snipping cleverly out of some wire mesh to create those. And of course, some kind of armature like this little horse here is great for the basis of a model. We talked about hot glue already a moment ago, but hot glue is great for anything that wants a kind of an organic texture. It's great for vines or roots or anything like that. Or you need just in a puddle of goo. You can do full scale cobwebs with it, but that also in model scale can be, you need a little thin rope. You want to suggest something that's going to be just a little strand of like, a clothesline thickness. Anything that you're going to put in there, a piece of string, a piece of twine, is going to look like a hawser, So you want something a little delicate. It's a little fragile to work with, but you can make little hot glue strings as well with that. And it's useful for making the suggestion of water if you need that. It's also just fun to kind of play around with. That's why, I was kind of tongue-in-cheek at the beginning saying anything can be in your model. Anything in the world can be in your model, with a few exceptions. But sometimes I will play around with materials in the model that then end up being inspirations for the full-scale thing. So instead of saying, well, how am I going to make this thing in the real world look like it's accurate in the model, you can play around with textures in the model that look like something that you want to enlarge into the real world. So I took some foil duct tape in here, some foil plumber's heating tape, and crumpled it up and used that. And actually did use that in a set years ago for King Lear, and brushed on some acrylic paint and then wiped it off before it was dry, and it created this great kind of like, iron door thing that we were doing. Just pressing some bobinette into some wet gesso and then painting over on top of that can create some interesting textures. That's the meat tray there, the food tray there with the brick wall and the plaster, kind of just carving into that. And then my little sandpaper grass trick as well. So play around with different kind of materials that might be an inspiration for something, a texture or a surface that you want to try to create in the full scale. All right, adhesives. So just masking tape, Scotch tape, those are great useful things. Straight pins to hold things in place temporarily, tacks, all that kind of stuff. Some plain old tacky glue, a little 2-ounce bottle like this. It's a couple of bucks, and that's basically what you're going to need for set one. You probably want a bigger bottle for grad school or BFA, but it's pretty much what you need. One good bottle, if you take care of it, will last you for years. And the little mini hot glue guns are really useful as well, especially if they have the two temperature settings. PVA glue just means polyvinyl acrylic. It just means white glue. There's lots of different kinds of them, but I don't recommend using Elmer's glue unless you're using it as a texture surface. You're painting it on with a brush and you want a kind of a shiny, rough, wavy surface, and you're using the glue as a surface as opposed to an adhesive, because it just doesn't dry fast enough. The one exception to that is when you're just like sticking two pieces of foam core together. You can just brush the Elmer's glue on it, squish them together, set a book on it, go have dinner, but don't use the white glues, the PVA glues, or something that you're going to have to hold in place while you're waiting for it to dry, because it's going to take forever. Sobo is one kind of exception to that. It's a fabric glue, and that is good for gluing fabric. But otherwise, you want to look at Tacky glues. And again, Aleene's the king of Tacky glues, but Elmer's makes their own version. There's a few other different kind of off-brands. Michael's craft store probably has their own Tacky glue brand or whatever. It's just basically a super thick, gooey white glue that holds its form a lot faster and dries a lot faster. That's why it's tacky. It's already kind of halfway dry when you squeeze it out, and you can hold two pieces of paper together for 30 seconds and they're dry instead of like 3 minutes with a regular white glue. There's all kinds of pastes and putties, and I use these occasionally. These are great for, again, laminating something. You print out something, a floor treatment or whatever, and you want to glue it down to a piece of foam core or illustration board or whatever. You can brush this stuff on. It's great. Yes, it's a little kind of the consistency of butter, and nori is a little thinner than that, kind of yogurt consistency, and they're great for kind of brushing on for two flat things together. And don't forget, plain old rubber cement. It's cheap, it's easy, it's forgiving. You can peel it off real easily. It's not a bad thing to use in your model. Same thing with plain old poster tack. That's great for holding things down in temporary positions. Although my favorite for that is museum wax. It's super inexpensive. It's a little tub like this. It'll last you forever. It's kind of a cross between wax and Post-it notes. So you can stick it down to your little figure if you don't want to glue them down. You can stick down some pieces of scenery that move. Maybe you have a wagon that's in two different positions, or you can tack it down so it's not falling over all the time in your model with a little tiny dab of this museum wax, and it's terrific. They make another product, a putty version of that, Quake Hold, which does what the picture shows you there. Mod Podge is a big favorite of some people. I've never really seen the big deal with it, but it's basically kind of a glue that's made for decoupaging, and if you like it, I highly recommend that you keep on using it. And it's just great for that same kind of thing, gluing one surface down to another. It's also a good sealant in place of gesso. If you don't want the chalkiness of gesso, the Mod Podge is good for that. It comes in both a shiny version and a matte version, and that can be useful, but I tend to use gesso. Gesso is what artists use to prime canvases. That's its main purpose, but it's also great for creating texture. It's really useful for creating one surface to paint over multiple kinds of materials. I'll talk more about that in a second. There's this tissue paper pressed into the gesso to create this interesting texture up in the upper right hand corner. You can just stipple into it with a brush to make kind of a little stucco texture. Somebody's used gesso with a stencil over here and created this interesting relief texture, and that's kind of cool. But what I was talking about a moment ago was the idea that maybe you want to create a white model, or you want to paint it all one surface, but you've made it from a little bit of foam core, a little bit of bead foam, a little bit of pink foam, a little bit of Frankenstein parts here. This way you can paint the whole thing with a coat of gesso as a base coat. And then you've got one contiguous surface to do all your painting on. So your paint is not going to be fighting with different colors of material or different absorptions. So it's a great base coat. Spray adhesives are a thing. They're really good for gluing like paper to illustration board or foam core or whatever. I'm usually a little leery about them. You have to worry about overspray or else you're going to get all your studio sticky. But more importantly, you really want to work in big pieces and don't worry too much about getting it perfectly square. So if you want to take that sheet of drafting that you've printed out, spray the whole thing and then spray the piece of foam core you want to glue it to, let it sit for however long it says on the can, follow the instructions. And then really you've only got a couple of seconds to get that paper on the foam core and get it arranged a little bit, rub out the wrinkles and the air bubbles and things, and then that's it. It grabs really fast. It's kind of unforgiving that way. And then you really want to let it dry. Never try to cut wet paper. Let it dry and then cut out the various pieces of your model. Don't try to cut out the pieces of the model and the paper first and then attach them one at a time. That'll take twice as long, and then you're not going to get them aligned right. So just get it on the foam core, even if it's a little crooked, and then when you cut out your pieces, it'll be fine. Cut it out from the piece of paper, not trying to stick them cut out onto the foam core. That's almost impossible. Some people use super glue. It's good for models that have a lot of plastic in them or bits of metal. I just tend to get it all over my fingers and try to avoid it. Epoxies just mean it's a two-part kind of glue, and with the possible exception of Bondo, which is a little hazardous, but it's great for gluing things that just are not going to stick together any other way. Basically, an epoxy just simply means it has two parts, an A and a B, and you mix them together, and you've got a little bit of time before they harden up. It's kind of a bit of an overkill for most model things. Great in the prop shop, but you probably don't need to mess with epoxies at all. When it comes time to paint your model, though, I highly recommend that you just use simple acrylic paints. Don't try to paint with watercolors unless you're just painting on paper. So if you're cutting out a cardstock model and then you want to paint first, let it dry thoroughly, and then cut it out. You're going to have a whole lot less warpage if you're painting the paper products first and then cutting them out than if they're freestanding. They're going to curl and cup and do all kinds of unpleasant things. But just any kind of acrylic paint is great. These little economy tubes that you can get in an art store or hardware store or whatever are fine. But you can even paint with scenic paint or house paint, even. Really, any kind of paint is fine. All right, we're going to do how-to tips and tricks here. So this is just a lot of things about making sure. 3, 2, 1. All right, now all the tips and tricks parts I was talking about. These are all ways to improve your models. I really want you to include at least one scale figure in your models. They don't have to be cute little cutout figures like this. It can just be a simple little, architectural drawing figure. But it's great to make them have a little bit of character if you are artistically inclined that way. I can't stress this enough. Please use fresh blades. The difference between on the picture on the left there, the one on the top and the one on the bottom is a fresh blade. If you're borrowing a knife from somebody else, the blade's probably already dull. If you've been using it to cut a lot of things and you're starting to really feel resistance, it's time to change that blade because you're just going to start tearing the paper. And again, remember, it's a dangerous thing because a dull blade is more likely to slip than a sharp blade, and that's where you can get injured. The picture on the right is actually a model that was turned in by a student, and we won't mention any names, but that's really somebody who knew better. And that's a really unacceptable level of damage to the foam core by using a dull blade to cut it out. So don't be that person. You want to really try to keep your knife vertical unless you want an angled cut, and then of course just keep it consistent. So if you're kind of letting the knife sway from side to side as you're making your cut, it's going to have an uneven, wobbly surface at the bottom when you try to glue it to some other surface. So unless you're trying to make it wavy, you want to keep your knife nice and vertical and keep it very still as you go along. And really keeping organized is very important. Just laying your model out before you start gluing it, dry fit it, which just simply means try the pieces, don't put glue on it to see if it fits, try it out first. You can pin things together. That's where the drafting tape comes in nicely. You can kind of tape pieces together or clips or clamps or whatever and try to get as much of the model assembled before you go at it with the glue, because then you can realize that there's still time to make a change, or, oh, that's a little too long, I need to trim that down a bit. Also, laying things out in an orderly fashion like this will keep you from accidentally picking up a piece of foam core, for example, that's rotated 90 degrees and you're actually gluing the side to the bottom instead of the bottom to the bottom. And then you just realize, oh gosh, a tiny little rotation, 1/4 turn has screwed up my model and I've got to start over again or tear this off. You can really save yourself a lot of frustration if you're just very methodical with the way you start cutting out your materials, because like Grandpa says, measure twice, cut once, right? Maybe even measure 3 times, especially if you're cutting an expensive piece of material in half or whatever. You've gone out and you've bought a $6 piece of black foam core and you need to start cutting out big chunks out of it. Really double, triple check. It's so easy, especially when you're using a scale rule upside down, as we frequently do. Like here in the photograph, it's really easy to measure on the wrong side of a number because you're reading it from left to right, but you're actually upside down, so you actually need to be reading it in the other direction, and suddenly why is everything an inch off? Oh, because I was rounding in the wrong direction. So it's really important to think through before you cut and before you glue. I can't stress this enough. Really cut 3 times or it will tear. This is especially true with foam core, but it's good for all kinds of material, and for heavier materials you may even need to cut more than 3 times. The first time that you want to go over with your knife is just to score it, or in the case of foam core, you're only trying to cut the top part of the little Oreo there, right? There's foam with a little paper on the top and the bottom. So if all you're doing is just cutting a little piece of paper with that first cut, don't even try to cut it all the way through on the first time. And then the second pass, you just put your blade right back into that little slot and go right down again. Maybe you're going to actually try to cut all the way through, but you're going to assume you didn't, because usually there's a few little spots that are little hanging chads, little bits that are tenacious, and that third time through will just pop it off. So when you make the cut all the way through, the piece should just naturally fall apart, fall away. If you have to reach and grab it and yank, it's going to tear. Even if it's just a little bit, it's going to be an ugly little scab on your model, or you could have a total disaster like what's going on in this picture right here. So really, the 3-time cutting rule, and even better than counting the number of times, is just you'll feel when it kind of goes pop and it sort of separates, especially with foam core. It's really easy to tell when it's actually cut all the way through. Overshoot on outside corners, because remember, you're cutting at an angle, your blade is a triangle, so if you stop right at the corners, then you've got a triangle shaped bit that's not cut down below on the other side. So just keep on going over the corners if it's okay to, that's waste area. That's the easiest way to do it. Or if you're cutting on an inside corner, then you want to pull away from the corner first of all, and then you can even like lift up the foam. Sometimes we'll rest it up a little bit in the air and then stab straight down with the blade in the corner with the flat side against the corner. And you can do that on both 90-degree corners or whatever. And that's a great way to kind of pop that little corner out. Again, you can always flip it over and cut it from the other side as well if there's a little tiny bit of paper that you haven't quite got. Don't pull and tear. Use pins to attach pieces as the glue is drying. This on the picture on the right here, the foam core is just bowing a little bit. There's a little bit of a gap. It's not going to dry nicely. You could stand there and hold it for 5 minutes, but you got better things to do. So just take a straight pin and stick that in there, and you can leave the pin in if you want, or just pull them out later. And then there's another little trick that you can do with making multiple photocopies of your drafting, and then you can tape that down to your foam core and go over it with a pen. I like to use a colored pen, red or blue, so I can see what I've done, and just kind of gently press onto the foam core by tracing over the lines on your drafting. And then when you take your paper away, you'll have pressed, you kind of crushed in a little groove in the foam core that you'll be able to see, and that can be a guide for cutting out shapes. That's really useful for complicated curves and organic shapes. When you're just cutting out a rectangle or something, it's pretty easy just to measure. It's not worth doing all this tracing over. But if you have some strange round platform that's got a lot of complicated curves in it, don't measure that all out again. Just trace over it, lift up your paper, and cut where you see the little seams. You can also do that same kind of trick by simply sticking it to the foam core and leaving it there. So this is just some printing of the drafting. I've mentioned that a couple of times now, where I've even added some wallpaper to the printing before I printed it, and then just stuck it right on this foam core. It looks like the little paper door has fallen off the masking tape hinge, and that chair is a little squashed, but otherwise it's holding up well. And really, that whole notion about printing and photocopying, I can't repeat that enough. There's just, it's so easy to print right onto cardstock or to photocopy onto it. Score, fold, glue, and you're done with a white model. It's pretty slick. Same basic idea here with just printing and adhering it right onto the foam core. This is a little model for Ring Around the Moon we did a few years back, and this wasn't meant to be a display model or show and tell or anything. It's just something I gave to the director so he could have it sitting there next to him while he was blocking the show, and could keep him remembering, oh wait, is it 2 steps up? No, it's 3 steps up. You know, it's just some kind of visual reference. It really helps directors out to have that, and they don't have to be fancy. Again, really print when you can. For example, look at the windows in this little model here. That's just printed right onto, or photocopied right onto, some transparency acetate. So you can get them for the photocopier, which for some reason are much cheaper than the kind that you run through your printer. You can get them for laser or inkjet. The nice thing about the computer ones is that you can have color. So say you have a stained glass window or something like that. You can print those colors right onto the transparency film and cut it out, and there's your stained glass window. But even just the black lines from a photocopier can save you a lot of effort. So here's the leaded glass. Look outside through the window there, and you can see there's little wrought iron details on the balcony railing. Same thing. It's just black lines right onto the transparency. Obviously, the little frieze up above the windows there is just printed out. I don't know, maybe it was on blue paper or the paper was painted after it came out of the photocopier. It works either way. And obviously, the portrait above the fireplace is printed out as well. So there's lots of ways. Rugs is another good example. This one looks like it might have been hand painted. I can't quite tell. But any of that kind of stuff that you don't need to be painting with teeny tiny little brushes. You can just print and cut and fold, and it saves so much time, and it's perfectly acceptable. And then there's acetate for the finer details, like the steel railings on the cabaret model here, or again, we've seen this little gambler model a couple of times. Those aren't little steel rods on the handrails there. They're just printed on acetate, and we just pretend we don't see the clear plastic on there. But that's a great way to get really fine details. Don't use real fabric for fabric on stage. So if you're going to use like black masking, just use black construction paper, or even foam core is fine for that kind of thing. If you want to cyc, just use a piece of white paper or paint on it with some kind of beautiful sunset or whatever. It's much better to use paper as a fabric replacement than actual fabric, because the fabric is 24 times larger in half-inch scale, and it's 48 times larger than the model scale when it's in quarter-inch scale. So that piece of fabric that you put in your model is going to be like the scale of cargo netting. So that little red square right there is like that's the actual scale, and the blue square is how many times in half-inch scale. That's half-inch, not even in quarter-inch. So that piece of fabric is just going to be monstrously too big in your model. So you're much better off just finding an image that you want for some drapery and cutting those out, or just drawing it yourself, painting it, drawing it, whatever. If you want a little bit of detail in there to show that it's dimensional and not just painted on a surface, you can do what I'm doing in this picture here. I'm just taking a pen with the pen retracted, and I'm just kind of pressing into some foam there to create some little cartridge pleats in there to give it a little bit of dimensionality to it, and that's perfectly fine. Here's a little tiny quarter-inch model of that just drawn with pen and ink onto some paper for those drapes there. Perfectly adequate way to do that. Some architecture students are using vellum or tracing paper. It's kind of hard to tell here. I think it's vellum in this model with some kind of clear plastic dome thing that they're building, a little architectural model for some space. And that's a great tool that I use all the time, tracing paper and glue. So here's the streetcar model with a little bed there, and the mattress of the bed is just a piece of foam core sanded down to round the corners off, some wire for the bedsteads, and then the sheets on the bed are simply a piece of tracing paper that has been moistened with glue and then pressed down onto the foam and folded into those corner pleats there. And you can see there's a little hanging curtain there on our little wire curtain rod. It's the same exact thing. So if you want to do this little trick with the tracing paper, this is great for any kind of fabric. You need to throw a rug that's draped over the arm of a couch, or you want to create a pillow, or you want to create anything that's basically sort of soft and fabric-like. Just draw it out on some tracing paper, and then either paint over it, or I usually tend to use design marker so it doesn't get so wet. You don't want to cut it out wet. You'll just rip it up. It'll be a mess. Let it dry, and then cut it out, and then gently rub in some glue. This is perfect. Elmer's is perfect for this. You don't need to use fancy glues. Elmer's or Tacky glue or whatever you have at hand. Just going to massage that into it, and what that's doing is it's softening up the tracing paper so that it's pliable, and then also you can, once you got it shaped the way you want, when it dries, the glue will hold it in that shape. So that's a great way to make all kinds of soft goods, sheets, curtains, whatever you name it, into a model. And then masking borders, as I said a moment ago, can just be black construction paper or even foam board. It's fine. That's just representing the masking. We're not worrying about making realistic looking fabric in that case. Cutting circles without those tools I showed you before is a little tricky. I tend to just do this little trick where I'll take a compass, and sometimes I'll even turn it the other way. I'll use the lead as the center point, and the little needle that you usually put in the center, I'll use that to drag it around and kind of score the surface of the paper. I'm not worrying about it. I'm not trying to cut the foam core or the illustration board or whatever with it. I'm just trying to drag a little groove that is a guide for my coming back with a cutting knife. So here's another way to go about doing this. Once you've traced out that outline, even if you just do it in pencil, you can basically rough out the shape. That's the middle picture up there. Get that shape cut out to something manageable. And then you can just go along and score the outside edge. And I really recommend, just like any kind of cutting in foam core, do it in a couple of passes. Don't try to cut it all the way through in the first time. Just spin it around and strengthen that little groove that you've put in it, or even cut it the first time if you're just using a pencil to mark the circle. And then you can do this little trick here where you actually stab the the blade all the way through. And that has the advantage of the fact that higher up on the blade there, where it never really gets much use, it's probably still really sharp. So if you kind of use a little sort of reciprocating action, kind of like a sewing machine, as you're pushing it around on your circle, it's going to cut. It's going to make terrible squeaking noises, but other than that, you can make a pretty decent round cut that way. Flip it over, and any place where you've missed, you can come back in with a knife on the other side and cut the paper out. Don't try to yank on it. And then the real trick to this is to use some sandpaper at the end. You can see below my thumb in the picture in the bottom right there, where I haven't gotten around to sanding it yet. It's a little wonky looking, but then farther up on the curve where I have done the sanding already, it looks pretty good. It's not going to make a perfect circle this way, but in a pinch, if you only have one or two to do and you don't want to have any special tools, you can do it this way and it'll look okay. You can crush into foam. It's great to do this with the meat tray too, just using any kind of tools. You can use your fingernail, you can use a pen, you can do all kinds of things to actually crush in bricks or rocks or whatever. Go over with some gesso, paint it, it'll look fantastic. And then there's this great recommendation that I have for you is to wait and wait. And that means just use books, use heavy things to just squash down your model. This is especially true for this step of building your model box. If you let it just sit there, it'll warp a little bit and the glue won't dry right. It'll separate. It'll be kind of crooked and creaky. But just set a couple of books on it and then go have lunch. Just take some time, let things dry. Let the paint dry, let the glue dry. Don't try to rush it. So that's a good thing about not starting a model, the night before it's due, because this stuff takes time to dry, and you don't want to rush that. And when you do rush it, you're going to end up causing more problems. And you also want to do as much work flat as possible. So don't try to assemble your model and then paint it by reaching through your proscenium arch. Don't try to put in little thing, stick a little shelf on the wall or whatever. Do as much as you can flat and then assemble it. And then all you're doing is reaching through the proscenium arch to do little touch-ups where it didn't quite overlap right. So lie everything out, cut everything out, do all the work that you can, and then assemble after it's all done. And use small applicators for small glue jobs. So this is that little chair you saw earlier here, and it was so teeny tiny. I mean, look at my fingers there, it's teeny tiny. So coming at that with the nozzle of the glue gun would be like backing up a cement truck to fill a Dixie cup. I mean, it's just too big. So what I did was just took a little scrap bit of cardstock or something, and I stuck it into the glue, the rim of the glue, and then touched that little bit to the chair because I just needed the tiniest little bit. So if you're trying to always squeeze from the glue bottle, you're just going to have way too much glue. And then the last thing here is just to be really careful with scale, using found objects and not really considering it a scale. A lot of times people get excited. They found a little bead or a button or some kind of cute little thing and like, oh, this is perfect. Well, yeah, it is, except that it's totally out of scale. It's like twice as big as it actually should be. So sometimes it's just better to just cut something out of paper and do a couple of folds or whatever, because the scale is more important than how cute that it looks in your model. So just be careful when you're using found objects. It doesn't matter if it looks adorable in your hand. If it's the wrong scale, it's going to be deceptive in your model. And then last but not least, just good models take practice. I mean, this is some beautiful work by a professional model maker. It's certainly better than I could do. It's certainly better than I would expect you to do. And it takes a lot of time to make a beautiful model. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do your best and do something that looks great, but don't worry if it doesn't look exactly like this, because this takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience for that. It's also going to take a lot of patience and some time. You're going to need to devote some time for your model. Don't just say, oh, I'll do that tonight after dinner. It's due tomorrow. I've got a couple hours tonight. I can get this model done. You really want to do it in stages. It's much better. Your fingers get cramped. You get tired. Your eyes, you're staring tiny little things. You can get fatigued really fast building models. It's exhausting to build a model. And if you try to do it all in one big marathon run, you're just going to feel miserable at the end. And you're going to start making bad decisions. And it's just going to it's good enough. I don't care. Whereas if you do it in little chunks over a couple of days, it's going to be a much more enjoyable process. And you'll come back and everything will be dry and ready to go, and you won't be rushing things. So I really recommend that you plan ahead and have a lot of patience when you're doing your model building. So hopefully that's been all useful to you, and I want to see some really fantastic models from you all in the future.